Welcome back to our podcast. Today we have Sana, who is an impact investor, and she's got a lot of experience around both from the business side as well as from the investment side, making that social impact that we're all looking for in organizations. And welcome to our podcast, Sana.
Thanks so much, James. It's great to be here.
Now, Sana, you're the Chief Impact Officer, which is a new title that I haven't seen before for Spring Activator. And when we're looking at impact investing, we're all trying to get two sides of the coin. We're trying to get some kind of monetary return for that, as well as another type of return, and that is that social side. And I'm kind of wondering whether there is some sort of approach to evaluating how we do social impact investing, particularly whether there are quantifiable metrics. And I was wondering whether you could speak in terms of not only the approach of how we evaluate organizations, but what should we be looking for in terms of that social return?
Great. Thanks so much for the question, James, and happy to share the insights that I can. So the first step is to kind of just, take a step back and talk about the lay of the land of how impact investing has really matured in the last 10, 15 years. It's an area that has been around since probably the late 70s. It started off with more responsible investment, ESG, so environmental sustainable governance, greening, that started to be applied. But impact investing was coined by the GIN, or the Global Impact Investing Network, as putting capital towards causes that can generate both a financial, social, and environmental return. And so there's a lot of depth that has come to this sector from the evolution, but also just the range of players, whether it's different impact funds or asset managers. You're seeing a lot of the traditional financial players come into this space, such as BlackRock, TPG. And so we're getting to a point where the notion of aligning your values with your financial investments is becoming more topical and mainstream. And as a result of that, I think what I'm heartened by is seeing that there's also increased sophistication with the way that people talk about impact and are able to measure and monitor that impact. And so there's a variety of frameworks out there. There's the social return on investment as a tool, as well as other metrics that are called IRIS, which these are also globally recognized standards that allow asset managers and other investment managers that are looking at making impact investments to really understand the change that is being created through the intervention. And so lots of maturity is helping add that sophistication to the sector. And one of the examples that I'd like to cite as a group that has taken some pretty pioneering work in this space is Tonic, which is a global impact investing community. The tool and the framework that they developed, and I encourage everyone to check this out because it's also an open source tool, is they have something called 100% impact portfolio, which they have used the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals, also called the global goals, that have been set forth by the UN, and they go all the way from no poverty, zero hunger, reduced inequality, all the way down to economic growth, decent work, etc. And so there's effectively 17 broad themes. What Tonic then did was broaden that out further into, I think, another 50 themes. And so it allows for you, either as an individual or a portfolio investor, to really get a starting point of where you are with respect to where your capital has been allocated in terms of the impact and the goal that this is tied to, that it would help to achieve. So that for me is one of the really actionable tools out there to really give one a sense of, okay, I've set out on this mission of aligning my values with my investments, really making sure that the money that I'm investing in the causes that I care about is having that deeper impact and change, and is a great way to get started. So lots more, I think, is being done in this space, and the conversation keeps getting more interesting. And I think that impact investing and indeed impact entrepreneurship is here to stay.
Well, in terms of here to stay, are those metrics standardized? If we think of accounting metrics that we would look at to evaluate an organization, a balance sheet or an income statement, those are fairly standardized, and we can compare one organization to another. So if I'm an average retail investor, or an individual just looking around my community for somewhere to put my social impact money, if I look at organizations, are they providing these metrics that you've listed, and are they standardized so I can compare this organization to that organization, or is there still work that needs to be done in that area?
So, great question. And I think that there is indeed still work to be done on the standardization element. I think, though, here that there is also an incredible opportunity for retail investors to start to challenge the status quo and to go and ask our wealth managers for more responsible investment options. Because, yes, there is still some work around standardization of metrics, but if we even start to request more sort of impact aligned options as retail investors, then even at a very base sort of financial institution, there's this need then to offer those types of products. I agree, yes, that unlike the more traditional financial or investment space, where you have ROI or the certain type of financial return that's much easier to calculate. If you think about social impact investments, you're not only trying to capture that financial return, but also the impact on the community. And on that front, given the lens that everyone wears with respect to the type of change they're having, that whole community impact changes by the organization, but impact investors and on their investments, they still have to generate a financial return. And I think that's a key element that needs to be emphasized, that an impact investment doesn't necessarily forego the financial return, but in addition to a financial return, also provides a social and a community and an environmental return. So still work to be done to get things on a more common language as we have with traditional financial investments, but there's opportunity to also grow the sector by demanding more aligned investments.
Now, you've alluded to using of these metrics to evaluate for-profit organizations, and I'm wondering, in the charity world or the nonprofits, we're seeing a transition of many of those kinds of organizations to social enterprises, in which they're moving away from the donor or the sponsor model to one in which a social enterprise sells a product or a service which is used to fund their operations. I'm wondering whether you're also seeing that industry, the nonprofits and the charities, using similar kinds of metrics that the for-profits are using.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this move towards nonprofits spinning out social enterprises and thinking about more creative ways to achieve financial sustainability is a move in the right direction. I think that, and here, if I put on my spring hat, we see a lot of young founders, but also we have served nonprofits that are spinning out social enterprises as part of that mission. And so I think that it's a good trend. Whether they're using the same type of metrics, I think that's still a journey that is being walked on. With regards to trying to understand the economic, financial, social, community change and outcomes that are being created through those new social enterprises, that is certainly common with the way that an impact investor would assess this. But to date, there hasn't been, I think, as much transferability of what's happening in the nonprofit space in terms of how things are measured with as much with the for-profit. But again, like that's an opportunity to bring those worlds together, because I think the way that I see it is that business can and should be used as a force for good, and there's a place to measure the business and the financial and the investment side of things, but just as much to understand the impact of all the stakeholders, the wider community. And this is where, for example, the B Corp approach and has been a great movement, because it talks about shared value and creating companies that are trying to attain both financial and other return by looking at this multi sort of stakeholder approach. So while B Corp certification right now is only for for-profit companies, I think there's a space for nonprofits and social enterprise to have similar such standards that allow for measuring that whole, wider sort of stakeholder impact.
When you talk about stakeholders and you talk about the various social impacts that an organization can have, I imagine there must be some potential for conflict between those metrics that we're measuring. For example, in stakeholder analysis, we tend to evaluate stakeholders around their power, their legitimacy, and urgency, and that creates an idea of the organization's impact on the stakeholder and the stakeholder's impact on the organization. But if we look at social good objectives as well, we can see how social good objectives can conflict. It may be that something that alleviates world hunger increases the damage on the environment, for example. And I'm wondering whether this metric structure of social impact investing somehow takes into account the inherent conflicts that we may see between social goals or between stakeholders. How do we sort that out?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you raise. And here, actually, one other sort of framework that comes to mind is Acumen's approach to how they measure impact. And they've developed a really interesting framework that talks about both breadth and depth of impact. And I think that could be, in my mind, one of the approaches that might help to resolve some of that tension. Because when we think about breadth of impact, and this is looking ahead to the impact report that I'm producing for spring, we're able to communicate the number of businesses that we've supported or the level of funding that we've helped to raise, etc. But when we talk about depth of impact and really trying to understand, well, how attributable is the intervention that we're doing? And to your point, this sort of the cycle between the stakeholders, how does that impact get captured? That's definitely the harder piece. And I think that ourselves and other organizations continue to struggle with that, because there's the element of how you capture the data. Is it at different points in time? And so I think there's getting to really a deep understanding of the various levels of how a single intervention can have impact and the sort of longer lasting change. That's definitely the harder piece to measure, but it's one, again, I think that we're continuing to work and improve on. And again, just that Acumen again has some free resources that people can check out to understand how to resolve some of that tension, but also how to create systems that help you over time get better at reporting on those metrics that you set out.
I imagine, Sana, that time itself is an issue with metrics, and that if we look at some definitive social impact goals, such as that we want to alleviate polio, we can measure as to whether we've done that or not. We can see how many outbreaks of polio are occurring. But if we want to do something such as we want to improve education in society, that's, I imagine, a little more tricky to measure, because there's not only the immediate people that we impact, but there's the impact of the people adjacent to them, and it starts to become more difficult to see that ripple effect as we go from layer of person. As well, if we look at some social goals such as poverty, that one I suspect would be also difficult to say that we've definitively solved it, because over time the definition of poverty and what is poor and what isn't changes. If we look back to the 200 years ago, then everyone was poor there, because no matter how much money the richest person had 200 years ago, they couldn't afford a cell phone, because the richest person in the world could not buy a cell phone 200 years ago, but it's common today. So the definition of what is poor changes over time. So how do we incorporate in our social impact investing these long-term and perhaps nebulous social goals, which are difficult to say that we've accomplished them?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely because also it's evolving, to your point, that the actual nature of how we set the baseline changes over time. Um, at the same time, what I have seen is that whether you are an impact fund or an investor or a larger group trying to tackle some of these big social goals, really defining your investment thesis around the types of change that you're looking to make, being very specific about the types of, let's say, companies that you're going to be investing in, the stage that they're going to be at, having a horizon, thinking about a venture capital approach, even with a mission alignment. Usually funds are 10 years in nature with investment made in the first 5. And so you can kind of set parameters around the broader goal that you're looking to serve, and at the same time help to accelerate the impact of the company in this case that is contributing to that change. I think by no means is the nature of how we report on our impact perfect, but we have come a long way in a short space of time. I've also, an interesting trend I think is that, especially in the last 5 years, is there's a lot of startups in this space that have picked up that there's a gap in the measurement sort of area, and I believe, forget the name of the organization, in San Francisco, that has kind of collated all the different metrics that are out there, and they also help you customize what's going to be the best approach for your type of organization. So it's awesome to see the innovation that is happening in this space to help mitigate some of those issues with respect to the tension or the time frame and the evolving nature of standards, because they do change. Like even with B Corp and B Lab certification, they're constantly expanding the industries that they serve, because again, there's new things that are popping up everywhere. So I think just being aware that it's an evolving space, that there is a need to provide actionable insights, and that that change is happening. It takes long to happen, and recognizing that change affects multiple levels, and being very clear about that, I think helps. And I've also noticed that different types of entities, and as I mentioned already, Spring is about to do this too, are starting to produce these impact reports that outline with the deficiencies of how their approach is. And I think just even that transparency and holding ourselves accountable to the mission that we've set out to in terms of the change we want to have is going to help move the needle on all things impact.
Thank you, Sana. Do you have any closing takeaways or things that our listeners can implement?
Sure. I think as a impact entrepreneur in this space who's looking to really embed a deeper impact approach as you set out on your world-changing mission, I encourage everyone to definitely seek out what it might mean to be a certified B Corp. Spring is one, and it was a fantastic journey to go through the rigorous certification process. It's one of the approaches out there and one that's increasing global momentum in this regard. I think most recently Danone, this largest sort of European food and dairy conglomerate, certified as a B Corp, and it has a mission of certifying all its global subsidiaries, I think, by 2025. So the movement is here, and it's one to check out. And at the impact investing side of things, for even a retail investor, I encourage you to check out Tonic's 100% impact portfolio tool, because you can even just create a baseline of where you are today, what your money is invested in, and where you'd like to go next in terms of how you'd like to align your values with money. And final thing I would suggest is go out and pick up a copy of Joel Solomon's book called The Clean Money Revolution, which I'm very happy to say that Joel is a mentor and also was part of the Renewal Funds team in Vancouver. That book is a great read for anyone trying to explore what it means to enter the world of impact investing, the inherent need for a deeper impact approach to finance, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And so hopefully between those tools and frameworks, you're able to get a good understanding of the fact that impact investing and entrepreneurship are becoming more and more mainstream, and it's one of the ways that's going to help us create systemic change and have a lasting planet, frankly.
Okay, thank you for joining us today, Sana, and giving us an approach of how we can all make a difference.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, James.
Okay, goodbye.